Well, good day there, folks. This is Peter Skov from Music is a Journey. We are continuing our series of looking at the first 10 albums of a particular band. The recording date of this video is July 17th, and that is an important day because it is the release date of Deep Purple's debut album, Shades of Deep Purple, way back in 1968. So before we get into looking at those 10 albums, let's take a look at the history of the band, how everything came together. So we go back to 1967, and the Searchers' former drummer, Chris Curtis, had this idea to make a band, a kind of supergroup where musicians could come in and contribute or play for a bit and then leave whenever they liked or return whenever they liked. And he brought this idea to businessman Tony Edwards. And Tony Edwards was pretty impressed with the idea. So along with his colleagues John Coletta and Ron Hyre, they decided that they would back this project. So after Chris Curtis, the first person they decided to get into the band was John Lord. Now, John Lord had already established his name as the keyboard player for the Artwoods. Now, the Artwoods had since wrapped up, and John had gone on to form a band with Art Wood's younger brother, Ronnie Woods, which was called the Santa Barbara Machine Head, and they actually recorded a few tracks together. Then, after that, John left and joined the backing band for the Flowerpot Men. And it was at this time here that he was approached with the idea of this band Roundabout and asked if he would join. So at this time there, they also decided to bring in Nicky Simper as well on bass. Now, Nicky had formerly played with Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, and he actually was in the car the night of the fatal accident that took Johnny Kidd's life, and Nicky himself was seriously injured and hospitalized for a couple of months. So Nicky recommended a guitarist that he remembered seeing some years earlier when he and this other guitarist were playing in their respective bands. And that guitarist was Ritchie Blackmore. Now, Ritchie also had established quite a name for himself as a session musician, having already appeared on loads of recordings. As well, he had been a guitarist for the country western instrumental band called the Outlaws, and he had also played with Screaming Lord Sutch as well. He had appeared with Gene Vincent, right, and several other famous British artists. And at the time, he was over in Hamburg, where it said that he was practicing guitar 8 hours a day. So he was convinced to come over and audition for the band. But around this time, Chris Curtis was starting to get too much into LSD, and his behavior showed that he was no longer interested in the band that he had decided to form in the first place. So the management team let him go. So now the band was in need of a drummer, and Nicky Simper and John Lord thought, why not bring in the drummer from the Flowerpot Men backing band? But Ritchie had another person in mind, Bobby Woodman, and so he was asked to come in and join the band. So now we're at the beginning of 1968, actually March 1968. The band move into a house together with all their gear where they're going to live and write and rehearse. And they start looking for a singer. Now, they had some different singers in mind, including actually Rod Stewart, but finally they heard a singer singing for a band called The Maze, Rod Evans. And so they thought his voice would probably suit the style of music they were going for. So Rod Evans was contacted and asked to audition. When Rod Evans showed up for the audition, The Maze drummer, Ian Pace, followed him along. And at this point in time, the band's drummer, Bobby Woodman, was not really very satisfied with the musical direction the band was taking. And so he was actually vocally against it. So when Ian Pace showed up, Ritchie Blackmore remembered having seen him performing live in Hamburg 2 years prior. So Ritchie encouraged them to give him an audition, which of course he passed. Bobby Woodman was sent on his way, and the Mark I lineup was formed now, with Rod Evans on vocals, Ritchie Blackmore guitar, John Lord Hammond organ, Nicky Simper on bass, and Ian Pace on drums. This is in March, and in April the band then decided it was time for a name change. And there were some different ideas going around, but Ritchie Blackmore liked the name Deep Purple, which was the title of his grandmother's favorite song. So that was finally decided the band's new name would be Deep Purple. And then, in one weekend in May of 1968, they recorded their first album. They recorded it over a Saturday and a Sunday. John Lord says they were able to do it because they were so well rehearsed. And then the mixing was done on Monday, and the album was done. And, as I said, the album was then released on July 17th, 1968. Now, a little bit unusual for a British band, Deep Purple actually had been picked up by an American label, Tetragrammaton Records, and they were kind of a new label, and they were really trying to, put a lot of money behind things. So when Deep Purple then went off to the US, they were picked up by Limousine, and the offices of Tetragrammaton had an on-site chef. You could go in and order your food and he would prepare it for you. Now, the reason why they went off to the US so quickly, though, is because the single Hush from the album went to number 4. And so it was decided that since the album was actually doing fairly well in the US and also in Canada, I think Hush went to number 2 in Canada, let's get Deep Purple over to the United States and get them on a tour. So they actually joined up with Cream for Cream's farewell tour, and they played some gigs for Cream, I think, out on the West Coast and in California. However, the audience's reaction to Deep Purple's performance was much more than what Cream were actually hoping for, and it was a little bit too much for their taste, so Deep Purple were sent off the tour after just a few shows. However, the band was establishing a name for themselves in the US. So, with that in mind, very quickly the band was brought back into the studio to cut a second album, and that came out in October of 1968 in the United States, the Book of Talisman. The English release, the British release, wasn't going to come until almost a year later. So, let's take a look at these two albums. I want to talk about them together because my feeling is that they are almost a pair. Considering that they were recorded just 3 months apart, there's not exactly a lot of growth for the band to develop their music. And both albums have a lot in common. Joe South's Hush was released as a single from this one, and Neil Diamond's Kentucky Woman was released as a single from this one. Both have a jam instrumental track, and The Address, Wring That Neck. Both have a Beatles cover. Here they covered Help. Here they covered We Can Work It Out. Both have a short instrumental composition leading up to a cover song. From Shades of Deep Purple, it was Prelude to Happiness, followed by a cover of I'm So Glad. On this one here, it was called Exposition, followed by the Beatles cover We Can Work It Out. Both albums also close up with an extended arrangement of a cover. This one here, Hey Joe, and this one here, River Deep Mountain High. So both albums really seem to be cut from the same mold. However, my opinion is that this one is just slightly more poppy because it includes One More Rainy Day, which is very much a kind of, light, melodic British pop tune, and as well Love Help Me, which is also a very light tune, something that Deep Purple would never record anything like that again. Whereas Book of Talisman includes Shield, which I think is actually a really incredible piece of early progressive rock. As well, there is the ballad Anthem, which has a very beautiful chorus with backing vocals singing very wonderfully, as well as a instrumental part bringing in a couple of violins, or perhaps it's a violin and a viola, followed then by Ritchie Blackmore's guitar solo. So there is some change, this one here being slightly more to the poppy side, this one starting to get a little more to the progressive side, but both albums very, very similar. Tracks that I really like, I really actually love the Book of Talisman track off this one here too. It is a fast-paced, hard-rocking song with a fuzz-tone bass solo. I mean, that's pretty darn cool. The one kind of big difference between these two albums is that almost every track on this one begins with some sound effect, whereas only one track on this one begins with a sound effect, and that is just the blowing mountain winds before River Deep Mountain High. River Deep Mountain High, by the way, I also think is really a wonderful job. The mixing is a little bit shaky. There are times where the drums are just, a little bit too much in the background. The guitar sound is still quite tinny sounding even when they're rocking out a bit more. But both of these albums, especially this one, really show a side of Deep Purple that would be phased out within the next coming years. And that is the band being more of a progressive band, doing arrangements, almost like arrangements for like classical style, but done as a rock band. All right. So with the success of Deep Purple going on in the United States, the band then moved ahead to begin work on the third album in 1969. Early in 1969, they released a single called Amaretta, which was named after an actress who had appeared in the musical Hair, and with whom Rod Evans had fallen in love with. In fact, he was very much determined to get over to the US and be together with her, which started to set a bit of a tone for the rest of the band. The album that finally did come out there was self-titled album Deep Purple, with a piece from part of Hieronymus Bosch painting. I think on the inside there was I can't see it right there. So this album here definitely shows a change from the previous ones. We have like several months in between now, so that's good. We have, I think, just the one cover song, La Leña, but then we have again a kind of instrumental leading into another track, this time a Deep Purple original, a track called Fault Line, where some of the instruments are played backwards, whereas the bass and guitar, I think, are forward, while the drums and organ are backwards. Leads into The Painter, which is a really rousing, rocking track. We also have Deep Purple originals like Chasing Shadows, Blind, Why Didn't Rosemary, and Bird Has Flown. The album closes up with the three-part April, starting with acoustic guitar, electric guitar, an organ, and a choir. Next part being I think it's a quartet, including strings and I believe oboe. And then the final part is a Deep Purple rock-out type song here. So this album did not actually do as well, and part of the problem was that Deep Purple concluded their tour and this album was released, rather than releasing it just before the band was about to go on tour. Also, Tetragrammaton had been spending money so frivolously that they were approaching bankruptcy, and there wasn't enough funding to be able to go behind the promotion for this album. Deep Purple still weren't really making any big noise in the UK either. But what was going to happen next was really going to get attention for them in their home country. However, before that, things were going to happen. Ritchie Blackmore was thinking that he wanted the band to move more into a hard rock direction, whereas John Lord had more aspirations for composing orchestral type works, as they had done on April there. So the idea went into play that John Lord would compose a concerto for group and orchestra, and Deep Purple would be the group to play along with the orchestra. And that resulted in a Royal Albert Hall performance that was recorded and came out as their Concerto for Group and Orchestra album, which was their fourth release. However, prior to that, things were going to shake up a little bit in the home camp, with Ritchie Blackmore deciding that they should move ahead into a more hard rock direction. They began seeking out a new vocalist. As it was, Rod Evans was not perhaps the best voice for the harder sound that they were looking for, and as well, his ideas were more about heading over to the US and chasing after Amaretta. So they decided to replace him. Now, they had some different singers in mind once again. However, Ritchie Blackmore had seen Ian Gillan performing with Episode 6 and noticed Ian Gillan's style was developing into a more powerful vocal direction. Previously, Episode 6 had released several singles in the UK, which didn't really get them anywhere, and they were now moving into a more harder, heavy rock direction. So, Ian Gillan, let's see here, first drummer Mick Underwood, who knew Ritchie from The Outlaws. Mick Underwood had played in The Outlaws with Ritchie Blackmore. He said to Ritchie that he would introduce Ian Gillan to the band. And so they arranged for an audition and decided they wanted Ian Gillan. However, when Ian Gillan showed up, his writing partner Roger Glover also showed up, and Ian Gillan said, "I'm not going to join Deep Purple unless you take Roger as well," which had not been part of the plan. Originally, they weren't thinking to replace Nicky Simper, but since they were thinking, all right, so maybe he's not quite suitable for what we're planning to do, Ian Pace said, "Look, Roger Glover's a good bassist, why don't we just keep him? And so it was decided then that both Roger and Ian would join Deep Purple, effectively putting an end to episode 6, which Mick Underwood felt guilty about for some 10 years before Ian Gillan asked him to join as the drummer for his solo band, Gillan. But anyway, now the Mach 2 lineup fell into place, and they wanted to record a song a little bit more on the commercial side to try to get some attention at home. They decided to cover a song called Hallelujah, and they recorded the song with Roger Glover and Ian Gillan. However, Nicky Simper understood that he was supposed to be heading down to the studio to record a song on that particular day, and he got a call saying, it's okay, we've already recorded it, which was a little bit puzzling. Actually, one version I read was he was told they were having some problems and he didn't need to come down. Another version says he was told they already recorded it. And then it was up to, one story says the band's management, another story says John Lord, but anyway, someone had to tell Rod and Nicky that they had already been replaced while they thought they were still members of the band. Rod Evans, of course, went off to California and later on formed Captain Beyond, along with drummer Bobby Caldwell and former Iron Butterfly bass player Lee Dorman and guitarist Larry Reinhardt. Nicky Simper would go off to join another band at first with a female singer who later on became pregnant and gave up the band, and then he formed Warhorse, which was also a kind of heavy rock, early 70s heavy rock band with guitar and organ and a powerful vocalist in Ashley Holt. But anyway, so Mach 2 gets going. They record the Concerto for Group and Orchestra, and that actually does sell very well in England, and the band now have the attention of their home audience. Then Ritchie Blackmore is saying, well, the Concerto for Group and Orchestra was kind of a fun thing, but that's not the way I see Deep Purple going, and now we're going to try to do an album my way. So the band hits the studios in October of 1969 and begins work on their 4th studio album. Now just think about this for a moment. May 1968, they go into the studio to record their debut. October 1969, just 17 months later, they are in the studio recording their 4th album and already have released a live album with an orchestra of original material with an orchestra. That is pretty impressive output, and that's, how bands were doing it in the late 60s there. You have Vanilla Fudge also pumping out 5 albums in a space of something like 3 years. But anyway, we move on with the album that really plants the band, makes them a major headline around the world. This is Deep Purple in Rock. I think it was May 1970 that it was released. And, following the heels of Black Sabbath's debut album, this album is actually quite a very hard and heavy and raw sounding album. And with tracks, like Speed King and Child in Time, the band times it just perfectly as the heavy rock scene is really taking off around the world, actually. So, with Ritchie Blackmore's ferocious guitar playing and John Lord's savage organ playing and Ian Gillan's wild vocals, there's screams and powerful vocals, and of course the rhythm section, Ian Pace being an amazing drummer and Roger Glover really hammering down on the bass. This is just a great album for setting off the 1970s heavy rock scene. The band's touring schedule got to be pretty tight around this time. How they worked in the 70s, right? Like get in the studio, record, get out and tour, get in the studio, record, get out and tour. And so Fireball was actually written more under intermittent circumstances. When they had time, they did some writing, and there was never that time that the band had where they were all together working on the album and just getting it all done. They would come in, do some work, get out on the road, come back, do some work. But the album, came out in 1971, and it features the band moving a little bit more in a progressive direction now, especially with some of the songs on here, like Fools, which is a much more extended one, but other tracks too, No No No, Demon's Eye, combining the hard heavy rock style with a bit of a progressive edge. You have the Anyone's, what is it? We have the Mule, which is also considered one of the more progressive tracks on the album, and then the very humorous Anyone's Daughter. The title track, Fireball, a very speedy rocker, and actually I think the only Deep Purple song featuring Ian Pace playing a double bass drum. How about them beans, huh? And actually the drumming for that was recorded, I believe, in the corridor of the place where they were recording. One thing about the title track, Fireball, it seems to resemble a song called Rockstar by a band called Warpig. And I did a video about that previously where I actually spoke to one of the members via Facebook Messenger, one of the members of Warpig, and asked how that came about, but he didn't give an exact clear answer. So anyway, a case of similarity between Deep Purple's music and someone else. So with regards to chart success, album sales, tours, the band was doing really well. As for, personal finances, the band were still pretty poor. There were things, like Ian and Roger would take turns with the stage costumes because they couldn't afford to buy one each. However, things were going to change for their fortunes very, very soon. They were just about to become one of the biggest bands of all time. And we all know the story, how that panned out. They went off to Montreux in Switzerland. They were going to record in a hotel which had a casino on the first floor. And that night before they were going to commence their recording, Frank Zappa was performing and someone in the crowd shot a flare gun into the ceiling, which started a fire. And, everyone was, the hotel manager rushed everybody out of the building. I think nobody was hurt, but of course Deep Purple lost their recording venue, and that inspired the lyrics to the song Smoke on the Water, the smoke from the fire drifting across Lake Geneva, inspiring the title. And what a good fortune for them it turned out to be, because that is one of the biggest songs in rock history. Now, because they lost their recording space, they had to move over to a closed down hotel. It was bitterly cold. They put bed mattresses around on the walls to kind of soundproof the rooms. They got in the Rolling Stones mobile recording unit and got themselves all set up. And there's a funny story about when the band were going from their rooms to the recording space, they actually had to go outside. And when they had first arrived in Switzerland, they would say, "Oh, look, the Alps, wow." But, going from their room outside into the cold to get to the recording space, they would be like, "Oh, look at the Alps." So anyway, they cut the album there. And one of the songs that they worked very hard on was a song called Never Before. All 5 members worked very hard on it, and they hoped that was surely going to be a big single for them, a big success. And as it turned out, it was not. And in fact, I recently watched Chris Prophy's ranking of the songs off the album Machine Head, and he put Never Before as the least of the 7 tracks. And I tend to have to agree with him on that. But of course, the album that turned out then was this one here, Machine Head, and one of the, biggest, best albums in rock history. Has it been overplayed? Have we heard Smoke on the Water and Highway Star and Lazy enough times? Maybe we have, but I listened to this tons of times in the 80s when I was into Deep Purple. I listened to it again in the 2000s when I was really into Deep Purple. And then I got into my whole progressive rock thing, and after a few years I put this in my ears again, and I just thought, yeah, I get it, that this is really such an amazing album. Yeah, incredible. Space Truckin' as well. We've got Maybe I'm a Leo, which is one of my most favorite not popular Deep Purple songs. It just has such a really cool riff to it, very kind of funky riff. And then of course we have Pictures of Home with a Roger Glover bass solo. He did actually do one on the Fireball song as well. So lots of really cool stuff here. Ritchie Blackmore's guitar solo for Smoke on the Water is really wonderful. This version of the CD actually has some alternate versions of the songs with an alternate guitar solo, and it just is not the same. So an interesting thing about the song Smoke on the Water, a lot of stories behind that one, but it was originally not considered to be a song of any great importance other than, you know, another track on the album. And Ritchie had this kind of working riff, which they just called the dirt 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 song because of the dirt 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 sound to it. And Ritchie claims that, well, some people said that he actually took the riff from another band's music, but Ritchie claims that he actually just inverted Beethoven's, what is it, the Fifth Symphony, the dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. He just reversed those to da 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 da. So believe it if you will, but that's what Ritchie Blackmore says. And he says that if Beethoven were alive today, he would owe him a lot of money. Anyway, so they had that as the working title, and it was just that one night Roger Glover suddenly woke up from a dream in bed and just shouted "Smoke on the Water" and realized that would be the title of the song. Now the funny thing is, like I said, that song had not been released as a single. However, when the band went out to perform live, the audience really responded to that one, and that's what basically made that song so big. It was the audience reaction to that song. Okay. Oh, it looks like I happen to have Made in Japan here, which is not a studio album, so it actually shouldn't be part of the conversation, but I think it just came out of the box that way. So now the band is really, really freaking huge, and we start to find things like, who's getting credits for the writing? Well, Ritchie Blackmore says, I wrote the music, I wrote the riff for that, and I wrote this and that, you know, so I should be getting more credit for it, I should be getting more royalties. Well, you know, I wrote the lyrics, and I wrote that and this is starting to go on in the band, which of course does not make for a happy relationship once the band starts getting money coming in, and then members start trying to make a claim that they should get more than others. This particularly led to sour relations between Ian Gillan and Ritchie Blackmore. And I don't remember if it was that particular tour, but there was an incident where they were over in Japan and Ritchie Blackmore's attitude started getting a little bit more difficult. And they played a show in Osaka where Ritchie Blackmore was not happy with the audience response. And so the next night when they played a show in Tokyo, he decided that they weren't going to get an encore, because, you know, the Osaka crowd made him feel like Tokyo wasn't worth it. And so when they finished off their set, Ritchie left the stage, got in a limousine and went back to the hotel. And the rest of the members came out on stage, you know, to do the encore and found their guitarist was not there. And this, you know, led to them saying, sorry, but we can't give you an encore, which then set the crowd into a riot. Kind of an unusual thing for Japan, but it happens. And a funny thing is that when I was teaching here back in 2006, 2007, I had a student who was a woman in her 50s at that time, an insurance agent, and she told me that she had been at that concert. And I asked her about it, and she said, yeah, I broke 2 mirrors in the bathroom and broke one of the doors in the washroom, and I threw some chairs. So it's like, wow, that's a historic concert, because Deep Purple were then banned from playing at the Budokan Theater, and you were there taking part in the smashing up of things. But anyway, this, you know, led to things getting more and more difficult between Ritchie Blackmore and Ian Gillan. And so when they set about to record the next album, now I understand why Made in Japan is here, because the next album, Who Do We Think We Are, is not in its correct spot. It is somewhere else in a box buried under this table now. So let's just talk about Who Do We Think We Are. I do have it. I have the reissue with all the bonus tracks. So at this point here, once the band started to get together to record, tensions were getting pretty bad. Sometimes, you know, Ritchie would show up and record his bits, and Ian would show up later on to record his bits, or vice versa. Ian was not satisfied with Ritchie Blackmore's performance on one particular track. Ian also wrote the song Super Trooper? I think it was, or one of the tracks anyway, is written as a kind of criticism of Ritchie Blackmore. And to that, for one song called Painted Horse, Ritchie Blackmore said, that's the kind of singing style he's going to do. We don't want that on the album. I don't want it on the album. So, yeah. Who Do We Think We Are was released with A Woman from Tokyo as the single, but, you know, at this point here, tensions were just getting to be too bad. And while they were on tour one time, Ian Gillan just wrote a letter to the management and said, I'm really not happy with the way things are going, and I'm thinking of leaving. The point of the message was to tell management, you know, please step in and do something. But the response was, oh, Ian's leaving. Okay, we're going to have to find a new singer then. And then Richie said, well, then get rid of Roger as well. I never wanted him in the first place. Roger also had been suffering from several health issues while on tour. He sometimes had, I don't know, colds, allergies, whatever. So, and stomach problems from nervousness. So Roger Glover was sent home on an airplane, I think from New Zealand or something like that. So the band now had to set about looking for a new vocalist and new bass player once again. Now the bass player part was not so difficult. They ended up picking a fellow named Glenn Hughes, who played with a band called Trapeze. I'd done 3 albums with Trapeze there. Glenn Hughes had a great bass playing style, very funky, and also a very great vocal style. However, they felt that they should have a lead vocalist, not make a 4-piece band with one member as the lead vocalist. So they sought out a lead vocalist, and they got in hundreds of auditions on cassette. And apparently a lot of people were trying to sound like Ian Gillan, and one cassette even came accompanied with a note from the singer's mother saying he not only sings better than Ian Gillan, but looks better than him as well. There was one cassette, though, that accidentally got swept off the table and fell in the garbage bin, and when somebody was cleaning out the office, they found the tape, and the band were given it, and they listened to it, and they thought, this guy sounds pretty good. Let's get him in. And so David Coverdale, who was working in a haberdashery shop at the time, was asked to come in and audition for the band. David had sung with some other local bands. He had played in a band, or sung in a band called The Government, who'd actually recorded some tracks. And now he was basically an unknown guy, little bit overweight, quite young, kind of pimply, wearing glasses, and he was asked to come in, and he said he was just so nervous during his audition, he thought he had blown it. But he was accepted. Richie said, okay, we've got to get you to slim down a bit, we've got to get you some zit cream to clean up your face, and we've got to get you contact lenses. You cannot be going around with glasses on stage all the time. But he was accepted in. And I have actually somewhere under the desk here an old Cream or Circus magazine with an article talking about Deep Purple's new singer, David Coverdale, and what can we expect from the band as they go in to record their next album. That next album would, of course, be their 8th studio album, Burn. I find this is a very exciting album. You know, the Mach 2 lineup did great albums with In Rock, Fireball, Machine Head. Personally, I find Who Do We Think We Are is getting a little bit weak. It's not as exciting, it's not as impactful, or not as interesting. This is a band charged up and ready to go with new blood. The opening track, Burn, is just brilliant. Now we hear Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale taking turns on lead vocals. We've got, again, exciting, classically inspired guitar solos and keyboard solos. Great, great song. Might Just Take Your Life, Lay Down, Stay Down, Sail Away is a really cool song with a really cool riff that something like that. Really, really neat. Just a great track. We go on also, we've got like You Fool No One with an Ian Pace coming up with a rhythm riff, if you will, which developed into the song there. You Fool No One. And of course Mistreated, which is a lengthy one. It looks like it's 7 minutes and 27 seconds, which became actually a song that was popular not only for Deep Purple to play, but later on Rainbow and Whitesnake also playing that song. And finally, very curiously, an instrumental track called, what is it, A200, where John Lord is experimenting with a synthesizer, having used Hammond organ, piano, and even harpsichord in the past. We get our first taste of synthesizer with Deep Purple here. Yeah, a very exciting album. There's some bonus tracks on here. One is called Coronarius Redig, which was an instrumental track, which I find quite exciting. So, yes, good stuff. The band is still flying high, and Deep Purple then come out with album number 9, Stormbringer, and the title track Stormbringer being one off here to, be the single for the album. Quite an interesting album. I find it not as exciting as that one. They're starting to get a little bit more funky in the music as well. Maybe that's partly due to Glenn Hughes. However, Glenn Hughes also claiming that Ritchie Blackmore is a pretty funky guy himself. However, at this point, Ritchie Blackmore is starting to set his sights on a solo project called Babyface. And there were times during the rehearsals where he would start playing something and John Lord would say, "That's a really cool riff. What are we going to do with it?" He said, "Oh, no, that riff is for my Babyface project. It's not for Deep Purple." Which then other people thought, well, why even bring it up then? So anyway, after this album here, Ritchie Blackmore basically decided that he wanted to do something else. And, you know the story, Deep Purple were touring with an American band called Elf with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, and Ritchie Blackmore just decided, that's the guy I want to work with. And basically, Ritchie left Deep Purple, took most of Elf to start up his band Rainbow and record the first album, and then got pretty much pissed off at everyone in the band except Ronnie James Dio, fired everybody except Ronnie James Dio, and put together a new lineup for the next Rainbow album. Now, interesting the way things were to go, like over the next few years, Roger Glover would actually end up playing in Rainbow for a couple of albums, as well Don Airey, the current keyboard player for Deep Purple for the last 20 years even now, also played in Rainbow on a couple of albums. Ian Gillan would, of course, team up with Mick Underwood, but during the time that he was getting Gillan started, actually Ritchie Blackmore showed up at his place one time and said, "It's me, Ritchie, don't hit me. I just want to ask you if you would like to be the vocalist in my band." But maybe wisely so, Ian Gillan declined that. So anyway, you know, throughout Deep Purple's history so far, we've had the bass player and vocalist replaced twice, and now suddenly the lead guitarist, one of the two crucial figures in the formation of the band, along with John Lord, has now decided to walk off and do his own thing. And so the band had to decide, well, if we're going to continue, then we're going to need to find ourselves a new guitarist. And, of course, they eventually selected Tommy Bolin, American guitarist Tommy Bolin. Tommy already, you know, just on the cusp of starting his solo career after having played in a band called Zephyr and having played on several other albums by several other artists, either as a guest musician for that particular album or as a session musician or guest musician in various capacities. So Tommy Bolin comes in, the new lineup of Deep Purple. We're now on to Mark IV. And you know, it's a funny thing because after Roger Glover and Ian Gillan were out, Ian Paice said in an interview, "The sound of Deep Purple is Ritchie Blackmore and John Lord." However, at this point here, it became the sound of Deep Purple is John Lord and Ian Paice, because now Ritchie Blackmore is gone. So they put out one more album, similar in a way to Stormbringer, a little bit more on the funky side, a little bit more on the blues side. There was criticism about Ritchie Blackmore. They said, you know, he said that he wanted to leave the band to do something different, and then with Rainbow he did exactly the same thing that he was doing with Deep Purple. And Deep Purple was the band who did something different. However, that might have exactly been the different thing Ritchie wanted. He didn't want to change in the direction that Deep Purple were going. He wanted to do something different, meaning going back to being more of a serious, classically influenced hard rock, heavy rock player. But anyway, there it is, Come Taste the Band, the 10th album of Deep Purple. Do you realize we got up to 10 albums here during all this? And, of course, this is also the final album before the band splits up. 1976, Deep Purple decide to call it quits. Tommy Bolin continues off with his solo career with the second album, and then I think dies of an overdose, doesn't he? And that pretty much puts an end to that. Ian Paice and John Lord going off with Tony Ashton, forming PAL, Paice, Ashton, Lord, doing an album, and then John Lord joining up with David Coverdale in Whitesnake, and Ian Paice coming in for a couple of albums in Whitesnake as well. whatever happened, Rod Evans, after Captain Beyond, he was away for a bit. He tried to put together a new version of Deep Purple in the late 70s. Deep Purple's management called him out on it, and basically that ended his musical career forever. And he disappeared. Nicky Simper continued on after Warhorse. He did another album called Nicky Simper, another band called Nicky Simper's Fandango. He'd also done one, I think it was called Foxtrot or something like that. Not Foxtrot, something with a fox in the title anyway. And he continued on. He later on played in a band called Quatermass 2, along with Mick Underwood on drums and Don Airey as a guest keyboard player. Yeah, you know, the Deep Purple family just keeps, you know, falling together with either Deep Purple alumni or members who have worked together with Deep Purple alumni. It's a fascinating story. But we do see once again that by the 10th album, the band has fallen apart. As we have seen with most of the bands we've taken a look at in this series here, around the 7th or 8th album, tensions start building. Usually by the 8th album, a founding member is gone. By the 10th album, the band is either broken up or in a state where they're not really sure if they're going to continue and what's going to happen next. So that's how it seems to be going with most of those bands there from the late 60s and 1970s. And that, I think, should pretty much wrap it up for Deep Purple. I have a funny feeling I've forgotten to say something that I thought was important, but I can't remember what it is. Of course, yes, we know the you know, Mach 2 lineup getting back together again in 1984, and that was just around the time that I was becoming interested in Deep Purple. I'd picked up, you know, the early Tetragrammaton label ones on cassette, In Rock, Machine Head. I bought this book way back then, and shortly after that, it was announced Perfect Strangers was coming out. The Perfect Strangers video came out, and you know, the band has just simply continued on in various states since then. But there it is. Enough about Deep Purple. I've got another band to release, do my video of the first 10 albums, so I've got to get busy with that. Got to get this one out. Thanks everyone for watching. Please leave comments. It'd be pretty cool if you did, and see you in the next video soon. Bye all.